come with me to my ex's wedding. The most feared duke said yes, and nothing was the same. Sophia Bartlett had one plan. Walk into her ex's wedding on the arm of the most feared duke in England, hold her head high, and let Peter Joe see exactly what he threw away. Simple. Except nothing about Duke Morgan Leonard was simple. He was cold, dangerous, and powerful in ways that made grown men lower their eyes when he entered a room. And when Sophia knocked on his iron gates with nothing but her late mother's brooch and a desperate proposal, every sensible voice inside her said, "Turn back." He said yes, not for the brooch, not out of kindness. Morgan Leonard had his own reasons for walking into that wedding, reasons that had nothing to do with Sophia and everything to do with a debt the Hargrove family owed him. But then something happened that neither of them planned. 2 weeks living under the same roof, 2 weeks of him watching her, pushing her, teaching her to walk into a room like she owned it. And somewhere between the lessons and the silence and the moments neither of them could explain, a deal became something neither of them knew how to walk away from. Then came the night everything fell apart, and Sophia had to choose run, or fight for the life she never knew she wanted. Welcome to Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles. If you're ready for stories where the unexpected happens, where the forgotten rise and the underdogs turn the game around, hit that subscribe button now. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me your name, where you're watching from, and what's on your mind. Your name might be the one called out at the start of the next story. Like, share, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the drama, the revenge, and the secrets waiting to be uncovered. Welcome to the family. Now let's dive in. Sophia Bartlett had rehearsed the words 17 times on the carriage ride over. She had counted them, arranged them, discarded them, and started again. By the time the iron gates of Lenox Hall rose up through the morning mist, like something carved from a warning, she had settled on a version she believed in. She was less certain about her hands, which had decided, entirely without her permission, to tremble. The gates were enormous black iron, worked into patterns that were almost beautiful if you did not look too long at the shapes within them. The stone pillars on either side were older than most of the families in the county, and the man standing between them had the expression of someone who had turned away far more important visitors than a seamstress's daughter in a gray traveling coat. He looked at her the way people had been looking at Sophia her entire life, briefly, dismissively, with the particular economy of attention reserved for people who were not expected to matter. She told him her name. He told her the Duke did not receive unannounced visitors. She told him she understood completely. Then she stood exactly where she was and did not move. The gatekeeper tried patience first, then firmness, then a longer silence that he clearly believed would embarrass her into leaving. Sophia had been embarrassed by better men than this. She clasped her hands in front of her, kept her eyes on the gate, and waited. It was not stubbornness, exactly. It was the particular quality of someone who has already done the hardest thing, made the decision, stepped out of the door, climbed into the carriage, and has nothing left to lose by standing still. After several minutes that felt considerably longer, she asked for a single sheet of paper and something to write with. The gatekeeper's expression suggested this request was beneath him. He produced both anyway. Sophia wrote one line. She folded the paper once, handed it to him, and told him to give it to whoever decided things when the Duke was unavailable. The line read, "I have a proposition that will put you in the same room as the Earl of Thornwick and cost you nothing but one evening." She watched the gatekeeper disappear up the drive. She watched a bird settle on the left pillar and leave again. She watched the mist begin to thin against the stone walls of the hall, revealing more of the building than she had initially seen, and what she saw was not comforting. Lenox Hall was vast in the way that certain silences were vast. It did not announce itself. It simply was. In the manner of things that have been powerful for so long, they no longer feel the need to demonstrate it. The gatekeeper returned. His expression had changed in a way he was clearly trying to conceal. She was to be admitted. The walk up the drive took long enough that Sophia had time to observe the grounds and understand that everything about this place was deliberate. The trees were old and perfectly spaced. The gravel was even. The gardens visible at the east wing were immaculate, in the manner of things that were never permitted to be otherwise. Nothing here happened by accident. Everything served a purpose. She found herself wondering, As she reached the main entrance and was passed from the gatekeeper to a house steward with a quiet authority and a face that gave nothing away, whether she would be treated as a purpose or as an accident, the entrance hall was colder than outside. Stone floors, high ceilings, and the kind of furnishings that communicated wealth not through excess, but through absolute quality. A single painting on the right wall, a woman in blue, facing away from the viewer, was so precisely lit by the gray morning light coming through the tall windows that Sophia stopped walking for a moment before she caught herself. The steward, she would later learn his name was Edmund, and that he had worked at Lenox Hall for 23 years, led her through 2 corridors and stopped in front of a door at the end of the second one. He knocked. A single, measured sound. Then he opened the door and stepped aside without a word. Sophia walked in. The study was not what she had expected. She had imagined something theatrical, dark wood, hunting trophies, the aggressive ornamentation of a man who needed his surroundings to remind visitors of his importance. Instead, the room was spare and ordered. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk near the window, a cold fireplace, 2 chairs. The desk was positioned so that whoever sat behind it faced the door directly. There was no ambiguity about who was in command of this room, or any room this man occupied. Duke Morgan Leonard did not look up when she entered. He was reading something or appearing to read something, and he continued doing so for long enough that Sophia understood it was not distraction but choice. He was making her wait. She recognized the tactic immediately because she had seen Peter's father do it across a dinner table once, wearing a smile that said, "You are here because I allow it." She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. That made him look up. He was younger than she had anticipated. The stories had given her an impression of someone older, someone whose reputation had accumulated the weight of decades. Morgan Leonard was perhaps 32, with dark hair worn slightly longer than fashion preferred, and a face that was striking in its absolute stillness. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of an overcast morning, but the hard, specific gray of slate, the kind of stone that has been under pressure for a long time and has no intention of yielding. He studied her for a moment with the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to reading situations quickly and rarely found them interesting. Then he said, without preamble, that he had 5 minutes to spare. Sophia had planned to build to her proposal, to establish context, to frame her request carefully, to work toward the point the way one approached a nervous animal, indirectly and with patience. She looked at Morgan Leonard's face and understood that none of that would serve her here. He would see through every approach that was not a straight line. So, she took the straight line. She told him her name. She told him that the man she had intended to marry had instead arranged a match with Lady Cecilia Hargrove, daughter of the Earl of Thornwick, and that the wedding was in 2 weeks. She told him she had received an invitation, and she told him that she required someone to attend with her, someone whose presence would make it absolutely clear to every person in that room that she had not been reduced by what had happened to her, that she had, in fact, done rather better. Morgan listened to all of this without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked why she had come to him specifically. Sophia had prepared for this question. She reached into her coat and withdrew the velvet pouch containing her mother's brooch. She set it on the desk between them. She told him it had belonged to her mother, that it was the most valuable thing she owned, and that she was offering it in exchange for 1 evening of his time. Morgan glanced at the pouch. Then he looked back at her. He asked who the groom's family was. Sophia said the name. Hargrove. Something moved in his gray eyes. It was not large, not the kind of reaction a person would notice unless they were watching carefully, and Sophia was always watching carefully. But it was there, a sharpening, a shift in the quality of his attention that had not been present a moment before. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he reached out, picked up the velvet pouch, and placed it back in front of her. He told her to keep the brooch. He told her he had his own reasons for being present at a Hargrove wedding, and that her situation provided a convenient arrangement for both of them. He extended his hand across the desk. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about Peter Joe on a Tuesday, about the engagement announcement in the paper on a Wednesday, about the wedding invitation with her name in his handwriting on a Thursday. She thought about the woman she had been every single day since, smaller, quieter, taking up less space than she was entitled to because it seemed safer than being seen. She took Morgan's hand. His grip was brief and exact, the handshake of a man for whom agreements were serious things. Then he told her to be back in this room in 1 hour. There were terms to discuss. The terms, as it turned out, were not what Sophia had expected. She had assumed the arrangement would be straightforward. He would attend the wedding. She would stand beside him, hold her head up, let Peter Joe and his new wife and his mother and every person in that room who had ever looked through her see exactly what they had failed to account for. And then it would be over. She would go home, resume her life, and that would be the end of it. Morgan informed her, in the tone of someone delivering a weather report, that she would be staying at Lenox Hall for the duration of the 2 weeks prior to the wedding. Sophia told him she had a home. He told her the arrangement required them to be convincing, that two people who had never spent time together in the same room would not convince anyone of anything, that the kind of society she was about to walk into was composed of people who made their living noticing inconsistencies, and that she would be carrying the most glaring inconsistency possible herself into the middle of it. Sophia said she was perfectly capable of being convincing on her own. Morgan looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had, not unkindly, but with the absolute absence of the polite fictions most people maintained when they disagreed with you. He told her she had entered his study 40 minutes ago with her shoulders drawn forward, her eyes slightly lowered, and the specific posture of a person who had spent considerable time making herself smaller in rooms that didn't want her. He told her she had good instincts and a quick mind, and that neither of those things would be visible to anyone in that room if she walked in the way she was currently walking. There was a silence. Sophia wanted to argue. She was constructing an argument, several of them, in fact, each one sharper than the last. But somewhere underneath the impulse to push back was the quieter, harder knowledge that he was not wrong. She had walked into this room apologizing for herself in a dozen small ways she hadn't even noticed until he named them. She agreed to stay. The guest room Edmund showed her to was larger than her entire cottage. The bed was a dark carved wood with curtains the color of deep water. There was a writing desk by the window, a dressing table she would never use for the purposes it was intended, and a view of the East Gardens that was so perfectly composed it looked like someone had designed it to be looked at. She sat at the writing desk that evening and wrote to her friend Clara Whitmore, who lived 4 streets from Sophia's cottage, and who was the only person in the world who knew everything about Peter, about the 2 years of secret meetings, about the engagement announcement and the invitation, and the particular quality of humiliation that came from being discarded by someone who had once told you that you were the best thing in his life. The letter was 3 sentences long. She had made a catastrophic decision. The details would follow when she had made sense of them. Clara should not worry. She sealed it, left it on the desk for Edmund to post in the morning, and lay back on a bed that was softer than anything she had slept on in her life. She stared at the ceiling of Lenox Hall and waited for the fear to arrive, the rational, sensible fear of a woman who had just agreed to spend 2 weeks in the home of a man she did not know, in preparation for walking into a room full of people who would be delighted to see her fail. The fear didn't come. What came instead was something she hadn't felt in 4 months. Something with edges and heat and a quality she could only describe as forward, like a door opening rather than closing. She felt dangerous. She was not entirely sure what to do with that, but she held it carefully in the dark, the way one holds something fragile and new, and she did not let go of it before she fell asleep. Morgan was in the library at 6 in the morning when Sophia arrived, still pulling her hair into order and privately furious about the hour. He was seated at the long table in the center of the room, with a cup of something dark beside him, reading, in the precise and self-contained manner of a man who was completely comfortable with his own company and had no particular need for anyone else's. He told her to walk to the far end of the room. Sophia walked to the far end of the room. Morgan watched her do it. He did not speak while she walked. He simply watched, with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and when she reached the far wall and turned, he told her to do it again. She walked back. He set down what he was reading. He told her she was entering every room as though she was asking its permission, that her shoulders led inward, that her gaze dropped 2 inches before she reached her destination, every single time, that she moved in the specific way of someone who had learned, over many years, that taking up space was a risk. He told her to stop. Sophia informed him, with a degree of sharpness she did not bother to conceal, that she had been walking perfectly well for 24 years without his guidance. Morgan told her she had been surviving perfectly well, that surviving and commanding were different skills, and that the room she was about to walk into in 2 weeks would be full of people who would be looking for exactly the thing she was currently showing them, uncertainty, and that they would use it without hesitation. She walked the room again, and again, and again, until the muscles in her lower back ached, and she had memorized every book spine on the east shelves, and she wanted nothing more than to sit down and demand breakfast. He told her to do it one more time. She did it one more time. She lifted her chin. She dropped her shoulders back. She let her steps take their full length, instead of shortening them out of the habit of smallness. She walked to the far end of the room and she turned. Morgan was watching her with an expression that was not quite anything she could name. He said nothing for a moment. Then he told her to sit down and eat something. Over the breakfast that appeared from the kitchen with the same efficient silence that characterized everything at Lenox Hall, Morgan asked about Peter Joe. He asked it without particular emphasis, the way one asks about weather or traveling conditions. Sophia understood that this was a choice, that he was treating the subject as ordinary, so that she might answer ordinarily, without the thickness that came into her throat whenever someone asked with too much gentleness. She told him what Peter had said, the exact words, because she had not been able to stop hearing them for 4 months. That she was convenient. That loving her was easy in the way that bored him, that he needed someone who challenged him, and then, in the same conversation, that he needed someone his family approved of, as though those two things were the same. Morgan was quiet for long enough that Sophia thought he might not respond at all. Then he told her that Peter had described the precise dimensions of his own weakness and presented them to her as her fault, that it was a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that dressed itself as honesty and expected to be thanked for it. Sophia set down her cup. No one had ever said it that way. Not Clara, who had been furious on her behalf and generous with her sympathy. Not her own private thoughts, which had spent 4 months turning the words over and examining them from every angle. No one had simply named it, plainly and without ceremony, as what it was. She did not say anything for a moment. She picked up her cup again and drank her tea and looked out the window at the east gardens. Morgan returned to his reading as though nothing significant had happened. But something had. Sophia could feel it, some small, tight thing in her chest that had been clenched since a Tuesday in October, loosening by precisely 1 degree. By the end of the first week, she could walk into any room in Lenox Hall as though she had always belonged there. Edmund had noted it, in his quiet way, with nothing more than a slight adjustment in how he addressed her, still formal, but no longer the formality reserved for visitors. Morgan had not noted it aloud, but she caught him watching her cross the entrance hall one afternoon with an expression that was not quite neutral, and she filed that away without examining it too closely. The second week changed the nature of what they were doing. Morgan told her, at the start of it, that the physical lessons were sufficient. What remained was the language of the world she was about to enter. He said it was a language with its own grammar, its own specific way of delivering damage with a smile, of reducing a person in public while everyone around them nodded pleasantly, of making the target feel that any response would only confirm the wound. He told her she needed to learn not just how to absorb it, but how to return it. He began by playing Lady Alderton, Peter's mother. The transformation was subtle and deeply unsettling. Something shifted in his posture, in the set of his expression, in the quality of warmth he manufactured in his voice. When he spoke, the voice was lighter, the phrasing impeccably kind, and every syllable was a perfectly weighted small destruction. Miss Bartlett. What a remarkable surprise. We had rather assumed, but then, you always did have courage. I will say that for you. And your companion, I don't believe I know the name. Sophia felt her stomach drop. She had heard that exact voice across enough dinner tables to recognize it in her sleep. She answered poorly the first time. Her response was too direct, too plainly defensive, and Morgan told her so without cruelty, but without softening it either. A direct response to a veiled attack handed the advantage back to the person who launched it. They would see the wound. They would know they had landed the blow. She tried again. This time she deflected, turned the comment sideways, made it irrelevant, shifted the frame, so that by the time she finished speaking, Lady Alderton's observation had somehow become a compliment to Sophia and a mild exposure of the speaker's own limitations. It was delicate work. It required the kind of control that Sophia had never been asked to exercise because she had always simply removed herself from the room. Morgan dropped the performance and told her that was better. They worked through scenario after scenario. Peter's father, a casual dismissal from a society woman who had never met her. The particular cruelty of being introduced as a friend of the family when one had been rather more than that. The invitation to explain herself and how long have you and the Duke been acquainted that was designed to expose a timeline that didn't hold up. Sophia learned to answer questions she wasn't being asked, to redirect, to smile in a way that contained nothing that could be used against her. She was good at it, better than she had expected. Morgan told her so, once, and did not elaborate, which she had come to understand was the highest available praise. One evening, deep into the second week, she said something, a response to one of his scenarios that found a particular angle he had not anticipated, and she saw it, the corner of his mouth, the very beginning of something that had not quite committed to being a smile, and then decided against it, and then left anyway, before it fully arrived. He looked away, found something worth examining in the middle distance, but she had seen it. She said nothing. She continued with the exercise, but the warmth of it stayed with her through the rest of the evening, and into the night, that brief, involuntary crack in the surface of a man who had spent a very long time making sure his surface was uncrackable. Something had shifted between them that neither of them had named. Sophia understood that naming it would change things in ways that could not be undone, and so she did not name it. She simply carried it quietly, the way she carried the brooch with care, and without knowing yet what it would eventually be worth. 3 days before the wedding, Edmund brought the gown. It arrived in a long paper-wrapped package carried by 2 staff members and was laid across the bed in Sophia's room with the reverence of something genuinely significant. When she unwrapped it, she stood very still for a moment before she touched it. Deep wine-red silk. Not the color one chose when one wished to be ignored. The cut was precise, fitted through the bodice, and falling in a way that was elegant without being constructed, it moved like something alive. Long white gloves were folded beside it, and on top of them, placed there by someone who understood that it mattered, was her mother's brooch. She dressed without assistance. She had been dressing herself her entire life and saw no reason to change the habit now. When she was finished, she turned to the mirror on the dressing room wall. The woman looking back at her was wearing Sophia's face, and Sophia's brooch, and Sophia's history. But she was standing differently. She was carrying herself in the way that 2 weeks of early mornings and sore feet and relentless correction had built into her body the full length of her spine, the ease in her shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that came not from smallness but from self-possession. She did not recognize her. Or rather, she recognized someone she had not seen in a very long time. Someone she had been before 4 months of grief had taught her to make herself small again. She heard the door. Morgan stood in the doorway in a way that suggested he had been standing there for a moment before she turned. He was in his evening coat, black, perfectly fitted, the white of his cravat, the only interruption in a silhouette that was composed and entirely certain of itself. He looked at her without speaking. The silence was long enough to be significant. Then, he told her she was ready. She asked if he was certain. Not out of doubt, exactly, but because she needed to hear it from somewhere outside herself. He told her he was certain of very few things. That was one of them. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and reached up to adjust the brooch at her collarbone. A small correction, a fraction of an angle, and for a moment his fingers rested against the fabric just above her collar. She felt the warmth of it through the silk. Then he stepped back and was composed again, and the moment passed as though it had not happened. Sophia turned back to the mirror, standing in the lamplight of Lenox Hall, in a gown that had been made for her and a pair of white gloves that reached her elbows, and the brooch that was the only thing her mother had left her. She understood something she had been trying not to understand for several days. She was in trouble. Not the kind she had walked through the iron gates to manage. Not the public, performative trouble of walking into a wedding where everyone expected her to be small. The other kind. The kind that arrived quietly, without announcement, in early mornings in a library and evenings across a dining table, and one unguarded, almost smile that a man had tried very hard to take back. She was falling for Morgan Leonard. She did not say it. She barely let herself think it in terms that specific. But it sat there in the lamplight with her, large and inconvenient and entirely real, the knowledge that the man who was supposed to be a means to an end had become something she could not calculate or contain. Morgan was already at the door. He told her the carriage would be ready at 9. He told her to get some rest, and then he was gone. And the room was just a room again. And Sophia stood in front of the mirror for a long time after his footsteps had faded down the corridor. She pressed her fingertips briefly to her mother's brooch. Then she lifted her chin, looked herself in the eye, and told herself very firmly to be careful. She did not entirely believe it would help. If you're still here after all that, it shows you find the story interesting. If so, then do me this one favor. Hit subscribe on Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles. Also, drop a comment telling me what you think about the story so far. Your thoughts are always welcome here. The best part of this story hasn't even started yet. The Hargrove estate announced itself from half a mile away. It was the kind of property that had been designed specifically to make arriving guests feel the weight of their own insignificance. The long approach through manicured parkland, the house rising at the end of it like a statement of permanent authority, the candlelight already visible through the tall windows even in the late afternoon. Carriages lined the circular drive. Liveried footmen moved between them with practiced efficiency. The sound of a string quartet drifted faintly through the cold air from somewhere inside the house, polished and precise, and entirely indifferent to the people listening to it. Sophia sat very still in the carriage for the last quarter mile. Morgan sat across from her, watching the estate approach through the window with the expression of a man visiting a location he had marked on a private map a long time ago and was finally arriving at. He had not spoken since they turned off the main road. She had not asked him to. The silence between them by now had a quality she had not expected. Not the silence of strangers, but the particular quiet of two people who had spent enough time in each other's company to understand that not everything required words. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. Morgan stepped out first and turned, offering his hand. It was a gesture of performance, part of what they had constructed together, but when Sophia placed her hand in his and stepped down onto the gravel drive, the steadiness of his grip felt like something more than theater. She straightened to her full height. She let her shoulders settle. She looked at the entrance to the Hargrove estate, at the guests on the steps, at the faces already turning toward the new arrivals, at the particular stillness that moved through a crowd when something unexpected appeared and she walked. She felt every set of eyes the moment they passed through the entrance. It was not subtle. Conversations did not precisely stop, they continued, but at half volume, with a distracted quality that meant the words were being said while attention was elsewhere. Sophia kept her gaze level and her pace even, and her hand resting on Morgan's arm with the ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for years. A woman to their left leaned toward her companion and said something behind her fan. Sophia did not look. She had learned, in 2 weeks of careful instruction, that the worst thing one could do in a room like this was demonstrate awareness of being watched. Awareness was vulnerability. Indifference was armor. They had not crossed half the entrance hall before Lady Alderton found them. Peter's mother was a handsome woman in her middle years, dressed in silver-gray silk that matched her hair, and a smile that had been so long in service it had forgotten what it was disguising. She moved toward them with the unhurried assurance of someone on their own ground, and she directed the full warmth of that smile at Sophia with the precision of a weapon being aimed. Miss Bartlett, a pause perfectly timed, long enough to mean something, short enough to deny meaning anything. What a surprise. There it was. The exact intonation Sophia had heard across Morgan's dining room table a dozen times, delivered now with the additional texture of a real audience, of real stakes, of a real woman who had sent a wedding invitation to her son's discarded lover, specifically to watch what happened when she arrived. Sophia smiled back with a warmth that was equally constructed and considerably more serene. She told Lady Alderton it was a pleasure. She said she would not have missed it for the world that she had such affection for the family, and that she hoped the day was everything it was intended to be. She said the last part with a gentleness that contained, for anyone listening carefully enough, a very small blade of its own. Lady Alderton's smile held, but something shifted behind her eyes, a fractional recalibration, the recognition that the person standing in front of her was not the same person she had planned for. Her gaze moved to Morgan with the careful assessment of someone cataloging a threat. Morgan met her eyes with the absolute stillness of a man who had nothing to prove and knew it. He offered the minimal courtesy that his rank required and nothing more. Lady Alderton received it with the grace of a woman who understood she was being shown exactly as much as he intended to show her, and that there was nothing she could do about it. She excused herself a moment later. Sophia did not exhale until she was gone. Then she did very quietly, a single controlled breath, and Morgan, without looking at her, said in a voice pitched for her alone that she had handled it well. She told him not to sound so surprised. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the smile she had seen glimpses of before, but something adjacent to it. She filed it away with the others and turned her attention to the room. The ceremony was held in the estate's private chapel, a beautiful, suffocating space with stone walls and candles and the smell of lilies that was thick enough to taste. Sophia and Morgan were seated toward the back on the left side, which was where she had chosen to be, close enough to be seen, far enough from the front that she would not be the thing people looked at when they should be looking at the couple. The guests settled. The music changed. The bridesmaids processed in their pale blue, a color chosen, Sophia thought privately, to flatter the bride and diminish everyone else. Lady Cecilia Hargrove walked in on her father's arm and was exactly as beautiful as a woman marrying into the right family at the right time had every reason to be. She was polished and composed, and genuinely happy in a way that Sophia observed with something that was not quite jealousy, and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. Then Peter appeared at the front of the chapel. Sophia had prepared for this. She had rehearsed her own reactions the way she had rehearsed her posture and her deflections with deliberate, conscious repetition. She had told herself that she would feel nothing, or if she felt something, she would feel it quietly and show none of it. She had been almost certain she could manage it. What she had not prepared for was how ordinary he looked. He was exactly as she remembered the sandy hair, the easy way he carried his height, the smile he put on for rooms full of people that she had once believed was the real one. He stood at the front of the chapel in a coat that had been made for this occasion and waited for his bride with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was satisfied with it. Sophia looked at him and felt nothing she had not already survived. The ceremony moved through its appointed stages with the unhurried formality of a well-managed estate. The words were spoken. The promises were made. The officiant pronounced them. Peter kissed his bride with the appropriate measure of public feeling, and the congregation responded with the appropriate measure of approval. And then he turned to walk back down the aisle. His eyes found her before she had quite decided what her expression would be. It was not a searching look, it was something more involuntary than that. The way the eye moved toward a thing it had not meant to look at and could not entirely explain. He saw her. He saw Morgan beside her. He saw the wine-red silk and the white gloves and the particular way she was sitting straight, composed, entirely at ease, and something moved across his face. It was not triumph. It was not anger. It was not even surprise, exactly, though surprise was part of it. It was regret. The specific, irreversible kind. He was past her a moment later, moving up the aisle with his new bride on his arm, and the congregation was rising around them, and Sophia turned her eyes to the candles at the front of the chapel, and did not watch him go. Morgan said nothing. He simply stood when the rest of the congregation stood, and offered her his arm as they moved toward the doors, and she took it, and they walked out of the chapel and into the late afternoon light, without either of them acknowledging what had just happened. There was nothing to acknowledge. It was done. He was married. She was here. and the part of her that had spent 4 months waiting to feel something definitive when she saw him again had received its answer. Not heartbreak, not relief, but the quiet, conclusive sensation of a chapter ending on its last sentence. The reception was in the ballroom. It was everything the ceremony had been, and louder 100 conversations, and the string quartet in the gallery, and the warmth of too many candles, and too many people in a space designed to impress rather than to accommodate. Sophia moved through it with Morgan beside her, and understood, for the first time, what he had been trying to teach her over 2 weeks of early mornings and difficult conversations. She was not performing composure. She had it. The difference was absolute. They were watched. Of course, they were watched. Morgan Leonard at a social gathering was an event in itself, and Morgan Leonard, with an unknown woman on his arm, at the wedding of a family he had very particular reasons to regard with coldness, was a source of speculation that the room could not resist. Sophia felt it and let it be, the way one let a fire be warm without stepping into it. When the dancing began, Morgan led her onto the floor. He positioned them in the middle of the room, visible, deliberate, exactly as discussed. His hand settled at her waist, and hers rested on his shoulder, and they moved together with an ease that Sophia recognized, distantly, was not entirely manufactured. They had not practiced dancing. There had not been occasion to. But the 2 weeks of walking and standing and learning to occupy space with intention had given her body a fluency that translated. After a moment, Morgan said, quietly enough that only she could hear, that she was thinking about Peter. Sophia considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things he said to her. She checked herself honestly. She told him no. She told him she was thinking about him. The hand at her waist shifted the smallest possible adjustment, a fraction of an inch, and she was a degree closer to him than she had been, and neither of them remarked on it. And the music continued. She needed air an hour later. The terrace doors were open at the far end of the ballroom, and she slipped through them into the cold dark of the November garden, pulling a shawl around her shoulders and letting the chill clear her head. The sounds of the reception muffled behind her. The gardens were lit by lanterns along the stone paths, throwing long, warm shapes across the gravel. And for a moment, Sophia simply stood and breathed and existed in the uncomplicated relief of being alone. She was not alone long. She heard the terrace door open and did not turn immediately, assuming it was another guest seeking the same respite. Then the footstep pattern told her what her body recognized before her mind caught up. Peter. He came to stand a few feet away from her, his hands clasped behind his back in the way he always stood when he was about to say something he had prepared. He told her she looked different. He told her he was glad she had come, that he hoped the day had not been difficult, that he was, and he paused here in the way she remembered, the pause that was supposed to convey depth of feeling that he was worried about her. Sophia looked at him steadily. He told her Morgan Leonard was not a man she should be near, that there were things about Morgan's past, about his family, about the manner in which he had accumulated his influence that Sophia, with her warmth and her fundamental decency, was not equipped to navigate. He said it with the confidence of a man who had spent years being the person who decided what Sophia was and was not equipped for. She let him finish. Then she told him, without heat, without the trembling voice she would have had 4 months ago, without anything except the plain clarity of someone who had arrived at a conclusion and had no interest in revisiting the argument that led there. She told him that he had been given 2 years to choose her, that he had made his choice, and it was correct, for him, and that the courtesy she was asking for now was simply the same, to be allowed to make her own correct choice for herself. Peter's expression did something she did not expect. It cracked just slightly, just for a moment, and underneath it was not the smooth confidence she had spent 2 years believing in, but something younger and less certain, and considerably more afraid. He reached for her wrist. A voice came from the doorway behind them. Even and entirely certain, Morgan said, without raising it, that he would not do that if he were Peter. Peter released her before the sentence finished. He straightened. He looked at Morgan in the doorway, at the quality of stillness that Morgan occupied spaces with, the particular kind of authority that did not announce itself, and he made the decision that she supposed most men, in most situations, made, When confronted with it, he excused himself. He went back inside. The terrace was quiet again. Sophia stood in the lantern-lit garden for a moment and felt something she had been carrying since October finally set itself down. Not dramatically. Not with the weight of significance she might have anticipated. Just quietly. The way a long-carried thing put down itself when the carrying was complete. She turned to Morgan and told him she was ready to leave. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that she had spent 2 weeks learning to read and still found largely unreadable. Then he told her the carriage would be brought around. They left within the hour. The drive back to Lenox Hall was quiet in the way that the drive out had been, but with a different texture. Something had shifted in the space between them. Something that had been building through 17 days of early mornings and long evenings, and one almost smile, and a hand at her waist on a ballroom floor, sat in the carriage with them, and took up a considerable amount of space. Sophia watched the darkness move past the window, and did not try to name it. Not yet. When they arrived, Edmund received them with the quiet competence she had come to rely on, and Morgan moved immediately toward his study, with the air of a man who had a great deal to think about and intended to do it alone. Sophia went upstairs. She removed the white gloves and the wine-red gown and the brooch, and she sat in the chair by the window in her room and looked at the garden in the dark, and thought about the look on Peter's face when he had passed her in the chapel, and the feeling of Morgan's hand adjusting the fraction of distance between them on the dance floor, and the particular quality of his voice on the terrace, and she arrived, as she had been arriving for several days now, at the same uncomfortable, inescapable conclusion. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. In the morning, Morgan was different. The distinction was subtle enough that someone who had not spent 17 days learning the precise language of his expressions and silences might have missed it. He was perfectly correct, perfectly composed. He received her at breakfast with the same measured attention he brought to everything, and spoke about the events of the previous evening in the tone of a man summarizing a successful business operation. The arrangement had achieved its intended purpose. She had conducted herself well. The terms of their agreement had been fulfilled. She sat across from him and understood what was happening in the way one understood a thing one had been hoping would not be true. He told her she was free to return to her home whenever she wished. He would arrange a carriage. Edmund would see to anything she required for the journey. Sophia set down her cup. She told him he was not Peter. He looked at her. She told him Peter had left because he was frightened of what it would cost him to stay. That was cowardice, and it was the most honest thing about Peter, and she had made her peace with it. But Morgan was not leaving because of cost. He was leaving because allowing her to matter to him terrified him more than anything his enemies had ever managed to manufacture. And that was a different thing entirely. That was fear, dressed as practicality, and she had expected better from him than that. Morgan was very still. He told her the arrangement was a transaction, that she had entered into it with clear terms, and those terms had been met, that whatever she believed she felt had been produced by proximity and circumstance, and the natural warmth that developed between people who had spent an unusual amount of time in close company under unusual conditions. Sophia told him that was a very long way of saying he was afraid. Something moved across his face. She could not read it precisely enough to name it, but it was not the stillness he usually offered. It was something that was working very hard to be still, and not entirely succeeding. She told him she was not going to argue with him. She was not going to beg. She had spent enough of her life making herself smaller to fit spaces that did not want her, and she was not going to do it for him. Then she stood, and she told him she would be packed within the hour, and she left his study before he could respond. She packed with the same mechanical efficiency she had used when she arrived, her own things only. Nothing of his, nothing he had provided. The gown stayed in the wardrobe, the gloves stayed on the dressing table. She picked up her mother's brooch from the nightstand and fastened it at the collar of her gray traveling coat. She carried her own bag down. She refused Edmund's offer of assistance with a smile that was genuine in spite of everything. She accepted the carriage he had arranged without comment. The last thing she heard, standing in the entrance hall, was nothing. Lenox Hall was quiet in the way it had always been, quiet, vast, and ordered, and entirely self-contained. She got into the carriage and did not look back. She woke in the hours before dawn to the sound of footsteps in the corridor of the coaching inn where she had stopped for the night. The inn being halfway between Lenox Hall and her cottage, the carriage driver having sensibly suggested an overnight stop rather than a night journey. She lay in the dark and listened. The footsteps were not in the inn. They were in the part of her mind that had not yet agreed to let go of the sound of Morgan pacing outside her room 2 a.m. at Lenox Hall. She had heard it, lying awake on her last night there, his footsteps in the corridor, stopping at her door, remaining there for a long moment that felt longer than it probably was, and then continuing on. He had not knocked. She had not opened the door. But she knew, in the particular way one knew things one would rather not know, that he had stood there, and that whatever he had stood there with was not indifference. She stared at the ceiling of the coaching inn until the light began. Then she dressed and waited for the carriage. It came for her before the carriage did. Sophia was on a quiet road 2 miles from her cottage, the fields on either side gray with morning frost, when the hired carriage slowed without instruction and stopped entirely. She heard voices, male voices, low and purposeful, and then the door opened from the outside and a man she had never seen stood looking at her with the expression of someone completing a task. She was escorted. The word was precise. There was no physical force, but there was no question of refusal, either to a second carriage waiting at the verge, and driven for what she estimated to be 40 minutes, and brought through the gates of an estate she did not recognize. The house was large and cold, the grounds less maintained than Lenox Hall, the overall impression of a place that had been impressive once, and was now simply useful. She was shown to a room on the first floor. It was locked from the outside. The man who had collected her told her, politely and with great indifference, that she was a guest of Lord Ashby Crane, and that a message had been sent to the Duke of Lennox, and that she should make herself comfortable while she waited. Sophia stood in the center of the room after he left, and catalogued it with the particular attention Morgan had spent 2 weeks training into her. She was looking for the same thing she looked for in every room now, not exits first, but understanding first. The shape of the space, the objects in it, what they implied about who used it and how. There was a writing desk. On the writing desk, between a blotter and a small empty inkwell, was a letter opener, silver-handled, moderately weighty, entirely ordinary in the context of a writing desk, and considerably useful in the context of a locked room with one door. Sophia picked it up and sat down in the chair beside the desk and waited. She waited until she heard the footsteps outside the door, the particular quality of someone who had been standing guard for a while and had become careless with it, the way one became careless with tasks that were boring and seemed unlikely to require sudden attention. When the door opened, she was standing 3 feet to the right of where the guard expected her to be. What followed was brief and considerably louder than she had planned for, and resulted in the guard backing against the far wall and Sophia reaching the door before he recovered his composure. She was down the corridor and around the first corner before she heard him shouting. The ground floor was not difficult to navigate. The house was poorly staffed. Crane had not expected to need more than a skeleton presence for what he had imagined would be a straightforward act of leverage, and Sophia had the advantage of someone who was moving with a specific purpose in a space occupied by people who had not yet agreed on a response. She found a side door. She opened it. She stepped into the cold morning light of an unfamiliar garden. She was walking toward the gate in the east wall when she heard the carriages, 2 of them coming up the drive at a speed that suggested urgency. The first one stopped at the main entrance. The second came around to the east side, and the door opened, and Morgan stepped out. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He covered the distance between them in a way that was not quite running but contained the same quality of intent, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled stillness, not the careful composure, something stripped of all of that, something that had come through the usual surfaces, like light through a break in stone. He told her she had been supposed to be a hostage. She told him she had been bored. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression dissolved the last of the distance, the last of the careful construction, and what was underneath it was so unguarded and so direct that Sophia felt her breath leave her in a way that had nothing to do with her recent efforts at escape. His 2 men had already gone inside. Sophia could hear the particular sounds of a situation being resolved by people who were very good at resolving situations. She and Morgan stood in the cold east garden of Lord Ashby Crane's estate and looked at each other, without the protection of performance or agreement or the careful language of people who were not yet ready to say what they meant. He told her to come inside. There was work to do. But he said it with his hand at her elbow, not directing, just present, and she went. The work took 3 weeks. It was not simple work. Crane's leverage had been the product of years of careful accumulation documents, witnesses, political connections that he had cultivated with the patience of a man who understood that power was most useful when it was quiet. Morgan had been building his counterposition for considerably longer than 3 weeks. The events at Crane's estate provided him with something he had not previously had, a reason to stop being patient. Sophia was not excluded from it. She had, in the course of her time at Lenox Hall and her involuntary visit to Crane's property, understood more about the shape of what was at stake than Morgan had originally intended her to. He did not insult her by pretending otherwise. She sat at the table in his study on the 3rd day and told him what she had observed during her 40 minutes in Crane's carriage, the direction of travel, the quality of the roads, the glimpse she had caught of a specific property marker at the gate, and the information was useful. He did not tell her it was useful. He simply wrote it down and continued. By the end of the 3rd week, Crane's position had been systematically dismantled through the presentation of documented evidence to 3 of the most influential men in the county, each of whom had their own grievances with Crane's methods, and were glad of the means to address them. It was clean, measured, and absolute. Crane did not fall dramatically. He simply ceased to matter, which Morgan had always understood was the more permanent form of the thing. On the evening of the 22nd day, Sophia was in the library. She had taken to spending her evenings there in the manner of someone who had been given permission once and intended to continue until told otherwise. The fire was lit. The room smelled of old paper and the particular quality of warmth that only spaces that have contained a great deal of thought manage to accumulate over time. Morgan came in and sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was arranging words he intended to mean precisely. Then he told her that he had spent 15 years constructing a life in which needing nothing was the only reliable protection available. That he had been consistent in this. That he had not deviated from it regardless of what presented itself, because the cost of deviation had never seemed worth the risk. He told her she had made the entire construction completely impossible. Sophia set down what she was reading. He told her he was not asking her to disregard what his life involved, the complications, the history, the ongoing reality of a world that was not clean and was not predictable, and would require her to accept things she might prefer to refuse. He was not asking her to pretend those things were not present. He was telling her that she was the first person in 15 years for whom he was willing to examine whether the construction was necessary, whether the distance was protection, or simply habit dressed as protection. He told her that he loved her, quietly, without any of the elaborate architecture of the speech that surrounded it. Just those words, sitting in the library between them like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for someone to name it. Sophia looked at him across the firelight. She told him they would be frightened together, that this seemed entirely fair given the circumstances. Morgan looked at her for a long moment with the gray eyes that had been reading her since the first day she walked across his library floor. And this time, the thing in his expression did not pull back before it arrived. It came entirely the warmth, the certainty, and the sharp, crooked thing that was his real smile, the one she had been collecting pieces of for weeks, and it was so thoroughly and completely him that she felt it in the center of her chest, like something settling into place. They were married in the spring. The ceremony was in the chapel at Lenox Hall, the small one, not the formal one with a fire in the grate and candles on the altar, and the particular quality of light that came through stone windows on April mornings. Edmund stood to one side with the expression of someone who had suspected this outcome for some time, and was glad to have been proved right. Clara Whitmore stood to the other, wearing a dress Sophia had made for her, and crying with the complete lack of embarrassment of someone who felt things fully and had no intention of apologizing for it. Morgan's man Aldous, who had been with the Duke for 18 years and had the face of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing until recently, stood in the back and did not cry, but he was looking at the ceiling for an extended period that had no obvious explanation. There were no speeches. There was no performance. There was only the quiet, serious exchange of words between two people who understood what they were choosing and had chosen it anyway. Sophia opened her dressmaking house on a Thursday in September, 8 months after the wedding. It was not the establishment she would have opened before Morgan. Before, she would have taken a modest space in a respectable part of town and made modest dresses for women who paid moderately well and acknowledged her existence primarily in the context of whether their sleeves fit correctly. What she opened instead was something else. She had spent weeks designing the space, not just the workrooms, which were practical and well lit, and organized with the precision of someone who had learned the value of a well-ordered environment, but the reception room, where clients were met. The reception room was quietly stunning in the way Lenox Hall was quietly stunning, not through excess, but through the absolute confidence of someone who understood that quality spoke for itself and did not need to raise its voice. The clients came. At first because Morgan's name was attached to hers and curiosity was irresistible. Then because word moved through the right rooms in the right way, that the Duchess of Lennox understood what a woman needed to look like when she walked into a room that did not want her, and that the dresses she made accomplished exactly that. That they were dressed not for admiration but for authority. The waiting list grew long. Sophia managed it with the same combination of warmth and precision that had become her signature, and she built something that was entirely her own, carried in her own name, representing her own vision. Clara joined her in the second year, managing the administrative side with an efficiency that surprised everyone except Sophia, who had always known that Clara's talent for understanding people translated naturally into understanding what they needed before they knew to ask for it. Their daughter was born on a Wednesday in February, 2 years after the wedding. She arrived in the usual manner of new people, suddenly, completely, with a total disregard for the inconvenience of the hour, and she was named Eleanor, because both of them had said it aloud at the same moment, 3 months earlier when the question of names was raised, and had looked at each other across the dinner table in the quiet recognition of people who had reached the same conclusion by different routes. Eleanor had dark hair from the first, and eyes that had not yet decided their color, and the specific quality of alertness that suggested she was already paying close attention to everything. The guest room at Lenox Hall had been remade as a nursery some months before she arrived. The writing desk where Sophia had composed her catastrophic decision letter to Clara had been replaced by a low chest with rounded corners. The dressing table was gone. The view of the east gardens through the window remained, and the quality of light through those windows in the early morning was the same as it had always been: steady, pale, and full of the particular promise of something beginning. On a Sunday evening in March, Morgan stood in the doorway of the nursery watching the lamplight settle across the room. Sophia was in the chair by the window with Eleanor, who had recently discovered that the world contained more interesting things than sleep and was conducting an ongoing investigation of this fact. The fire was low. The house was quiet in the profound, inhabitable way. It was quiet on winter evenings when nothing was required of anyone. Morgan crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the low chest and looked at his wife and his daughter in the amber light, and the expression on his face was not the controlled stillness it had been when Sophia first walked into his study. It was not performing anything. It was simply there, the warmth, the fullness of it, the specific quality of a man who had spent 15 years building walls around himself and had, in the company of this woman, simply stopped. After a while, he opened the small drawer in the chest beside him. He took out the velvet pouch, Sophia's mother's brooch, which had been living in that drawer since the morning after the wedding, when Sophia had placed it there with the intention of finding it a proper home, and he set it on top of the chest. Beside it, he placed a small folded paper on which he had written something earlier that week, in the library, in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon when the house had been particularly still. He did not say anything about it. He simply left it there. Sophia read it later, after Eleanor had finally conceded to sleep, and Morgan had gone down to the library. The handwriting was his precise, angular, without ornament. For when you are old enough to understand what it means to walk through a door the world says is not yours. Sophia stood in the nursery for a long time, with the note in her hand and the brooch on the chest beside her, and her daughter asleep, in the room that had once been a guest suite in an estate she had entered uninvited, with trembling hands and a desperate plan. She thought about the woman she had been when she first came through these gates. The gray traveling coat, the careful 17 repetitions of words that dissolved on contact with the reality of Morgan Leonard's gray eyes, the shoulders that apologized for occupying space, the whole careful, contracted life she had been living, hemming edges, staying small, accepting the dimensions of a world that had not been built for her. She looked at the brooch. She looked at the note. She looked at Eleanor, asleep with the absolute confidence of someone who had never yet been told to take up less room. She placed the note back beside the brooch, folded exactly as Morgan had left it, and turned off the lamp. In the dark, she stood for one more moment in the room where the story had quietly, completely turned. Sophia Bartlett, who had once loved in secret and grieved in silence and walked through every room apologizing for being in it, stood in the center of her own life. And she stayed there. If you watched this story to the very end, then you already know this is the kind of place where the ones the world forgot about get to win. This is Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles, and we are just getting started. If you have not subscribed yet, then right now is the moment, because the next story is already waiting, and it is not going to wait long. Someone is about to walk through a door they were never supposed to open, and everything is about to change. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I want to know how far these stories travel. Tell me what you felt. Tell me which part stopped your breath. Your words matter here, and I read every single one. Like this video if Sophia's story stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the forgotten ones always have the best stories. And hit that notification bell so you are there the moment the next chapter begins. You found this channel for a reason. Welcome home.